All right, we're going to start our next session here, the Traction AMA with Josh David Miller. So we're going to dig into what traction means and how we can support you in getting traction. So if you're in the back, come on, let's get a little more intimate. Let's move on up here. I swear I won't spit. I don't know about Josh.
I might, but only if you piss me off.
So spit at me.
Well, that's how you know the concert was good.
I like it. I like it. Sorry to make you all move, but it's a little more enjoyable. Mo better. M-O better.
There's no H. It's not M-O-H, better.
Could be. I don't know.
I feel like it should be. It's Mo.
Mo better.
Mo.
Okay. Very good. Well, thanks for joining us for our next session here. So pretty free flowing here for the Traction AMA with JDM, or Josh David Miller. Has many other names. The dreaded
facilitator Miller. Yeah,
that one I always struggle with that one. The shredder of business models, amongst many other things. But yeah, we're looking forward to kind of just digging into what questions you have. Josh will kick us off with a little bit of like how he defines traction and looks at that, and then open to your questions so we can kind of dig into you and your businesses and answer any questions that you have around traction in general. So take it away, my friend, and maybe share a little bit more about, the right box and traction thinking and all of that good stuff. But thanks for and the Zero to Traction podcast as well.
Yeah, I'll shamelessly plug our podcast. Yeah, thanks so much for having me here. Super happy to be kind of hanging out in the Carlson Center talking traction, which is my favorite subject. So 30,000 foot view, because I'm not that interesting, so I'm not going to spend much time talking about me. But I'll say, yeah, I'm an entrepreneur who teaches entrepreneurs how to entrepreneur. Basically, I do a few different things. I have a pretty large giving back portfolio. I'm on the 1 Million Cups team with Cameron and Laura and several other.
Who's familiar with 1 Million Cups here?
Almost everyone. Okay.
All right. Cool.
For those of you who aren't, 1 Million Cups it's a weekly program sponsored by the Kauffman Foundation. Every single Wednesday, 9 a.m. local time, 130 or so chapters across the United States get to hear presentations from local startup founders. They get 6 minutes to talk about what they're working on, and then we, the audience of their peers, get 15 to 20 minutes to ask questions, provide advice, feedback, and so forth. We are actively recruiting presenters always for 1 Million Cups because we do hear 2 every single Wednesday. So we're always in need. So if you're an entrepreneur out there working on in a relatively early stage endeavor, within the last few years-ish kind of thing, hit us up. Any of us that are on the team would love to have a presentation. We also do live stream those on Facebook. So if you just want to go look at our back catalog or anything like to kind of see what it's all about, that would be great. But that's all about support and education. There are no pitches. That's why we call them presentations. So I'm on that. I do about 500,000 other things related to startups and entrepreneurship in that category. I also have, for those who are kind of building something, idea plus stage, maybe into like pre-seed towards seed stage, I have a brand called Traction Thinking, which is all kinds of digital products that help early stage startup founders find traction, kind of thinking about it differently, which I'm sure is a thing that we'll be talking about today since we're talking about traction. And so I have an online course that'll be launching soon all about customer discovery that I'm pretty excited about. So it's a self-paced online course. We have a webinar in partnership with Startup Sack that I think is December 6th or something like that. Laura's nodding her head is sort of yes there, so we'll see. Now that I said it out loud, it has to be a thing. That'll be all about creating products that customers just can't resist. We call the Startup Product Playbook. So that's for things a little bit further along. So yeah, giving back, and then traction thinking, and then I run a company called The Right Box, which is kind of my day job, I guess you could say. But that is we are a studio that helps startups find product market fit. So we work mostly with companies that are approximately in like the seed to Series A category, kind of helping them bridge that gap through this modification of a design sprint that we call a traction sprint, which is helping form hypotheses around your market hypothesis, finding the kind of weakest parts in that, figuring out a way to testing with real customers and doing that all inside the course for a few days, and then running that through rapid cycles until we find product market fit. Also do some work with some venture capital funds and universities and stuff like that. So it's all in that same category. So I spent all day doing traction, yay! Which is a good transition to say like what traction is. Because I think most of the time, if we were just like do a poll, I'm guessing that people would define traction as like the dollars that come rolling into a business. Like and I suppose in a sense that is like the ultimate traction is getting the dollars to roll in, only it's not, because you actually need the dollars to keep rolling in. We call that retention. And then you need that activity to further sales or future sales, which we call retention. So it's even not the ultimate, but for some reason, that's all we focus on. I actually define traction a little bit differently. I think of traction as the work you do to get customers to say yes that isn't sales. Eventually there will be, and I don't mean doesn't involve a transaction. I mean, there isn't a sales process. And once you get into the sales process, you're executing on something that's proven. And at that point, it's less about traction, it's more about scale. That's a whole other topic. Another way to think about traction that I often use is it's the acquisition of confirmatory data in support of a market hypothesis. So we think that this is a thing, and we go out and we test it with customers, and customers in some fashion say yes, and that is traction. But it's a ladder. You start really low on the ladder with a customer just saying, hey, that's interesting. Yeah, I've got that problem. All the way up to, again, retention and referral and everything else. So it's a whole big ladder that I'm sure we could break down, but I've been talking long enough.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ones that I've heard you say before is like evidence of customer buying behavior, right? And that's as you go through the different stages from idea to actually generating revenue, that evidence is different. And then, you often talk about how, as you're testing new hypotheses, like how do you proportion that to the bets of your actual experiments, right? So if we're just trying to see if there's actually a there where you're not investing a ton of resources, right? You're going out there doing customer discovery and talking to people. But then if they're actually generating revenue, you might be paying for certain ads or ways to get those additional customers out there. And so I think in terms of like diving in, like would maybe love to hear kind of like across some of those stages, maybe just from idea to pre-seed to seed, like what would be some of those traction metrics or traction evidence points that would make sense across that journey?
Yeah, I think that's probably a great way to frame the conversation. So if we were to kind of think about it from a meta level first, one of the core tenets of the lean startup is innovation accounting. And it's one of those things that Eric Ries did not really cover very much in his book. I think he spent like a page and a half on it or something stupid. For a central tenet, that was sort of silly and kind of this glaring hole. And basically, I think all his coverage really amounted to was, innovation accounting is not the same as innovative accounting, which is how you land up in the Huskow. Innovation accounting is about how you measure things before you can measure them. And so the idea is like, traditionally businesses measure things on the balance sheet, right? It's sales, it's assets, it's all those kinds of things at the end of the day. But in the early stages of a business, you can't do that because all of those metrics are functionally zero. Everything from your sales to the market share, like all of it's all functionally zero, even if it's not literally zero. It's not useful as a metric for anything. And so you have to have a different way of measuring success. And all of those are lagging indicators anyway, right? They tell us if we were successful yesterday. And what we're looking for in the early stage is something that tells us whether we will be successful tomorrow. Okay, we got to flip the script on that. So we're basically looking for like this whole chain of leading indicators that if we're successful on all of them, will eventually show up in the balance sheet. So in a really early stage startup, that the first evidence of buying behavior, that first traction, first rung of the ladder that we're getting is really just finding that there is a customer out there that we can get in front of, that every single time we try to get in front of these customers, we have a high likelihood of successfully getting in front of them, meaning they look the same. So it's not every time we hop in front of this group that we think is our customer, it's a hit or miss whether they are, right? It's first just, can we even get in front of the right people? And then the second part of it is fleshing out the right part of the right people, because that was doing some heavy lifting. And so that is what is their problem? Do they have the problem we think they do? Is the problem severe enough and urgent enough that they're going to pay anybody, money to actually fix that problem? And so in the really early stages, like your traction metric is probably just some form of customers saying, yeah, I've got that problem. Hopefully more than just raising their hand like that. Hopefully it's, yeah, oh my gosh, I've got that problem. Please, like, take my money. How you gonna solve that? So that's a really early stage. And then once you know that this group of people that you can really easily get in front of, that predictably and reliably have the problem that you think they do, then the next one is that not that they want any solution, but they want your solution particularly. And so that could be just a customer again saying, yes, I opt into that. It's weak evidence, but it's evidence. It's anecdotal and it's full of bias, but it is evidence. But then getting them to give something up in exchange. This is where you trade your email address to get on the wait list, or maybe you do a pre-sales. If you're doing B2B, you could do letters of intent. You could crowdfund and actually collect money before you have the thing. And then eventually, as you get further along in sales. So idea stage, it's probably a lot of customer interviews, customer conversations. As you get a little further along, it's going to be some form of early sales coupled with those tests that you do to really reliably get in front of audiences. And then by the time you get to seed stage, when you hit that, you have a pretty decent definition of your customer, it'll evolve. You have a pretty decent definition of product, it'll evolve. And you can kind of put those two things together, close some deals, get some sales rolling in, and then you're actually starting to measure that in sales. But again, it's still functionally zero at that point, all things being go, still functionally zero. And when you get to Series A, that's when the script actually flips, which is why it's good to stop in the conversation at that point, because the game just changes. What an investor, for example, is looking for at a Series A round is they look at your recent growth and looking for a pattern that we call double, double, triple, which is your revenue doubled, and it doubled again, and then it tripled, double, double, triple. And so at that point, we're actually just really looking at, is the machine kind of running? And if we just pour the gas of Series A on this, is it going to kind of explode? So the game changes then. So we'll stop there for the traction discussion, because I think it would just get too different.
Think of those idea to pre-seed to seed, you're building the components of that engine, right? So it's yes, you have a visual of what that engine might look like, but then you need to gain evidence along that journey to be able to actually put that engine together. I think one of the things you pointed out when you got to kind of the Series A component was the reason this evidence matters outside of just building a solid foundation for your business is those are usually the points that an investor is looking for, right? They, yes, want to understand the product and those types of things, but they're more interested in, is there demand in the market, and do you have the evidence pain points that they're actually looking for across that journey? And so the more you can speak to that evidence is actually going to help you close those investment deals to ultimately grow your business. And so I don't know if I don't know if this is a good time to maybe just chat and see where everyone's minds are at in the audience, if we want to get some of their AMA going, or if there's anything else that's kind of top of mind for you around traction.
Yeah, totally. Or put another way, try to stump me and Cameron. Try to stump us on this.
He's the master.
So. He's setting it up. He's setting it up right now for that.
Here we go. Danny, go ahead.
Okay. I am a disabled business owner certified. I need assistance with grant writing. Do you know someone I don't gotta pay?
So the question, just for our online audience, do you know he needs a grant writing and is looking for someone to write grants and not be paid? So I don't know that that exists. Partly, I don't know that you can actually legally even do that. In terms of you can't pay someone on the back end of a grant. You usually have to pay them up front in terms of grant writing. So that's.
Told yesterday by an investor that I could take the grant money and tell the grant writer I'll pay him back once I get the money. Is that not correct?
I mean, is it possible? Sure, but grants have a pretty low success rate anyway. So even if you find the willingness to do that, then there's the high likelihood that they're not going to get paid, which means you're going to pay a lot more on the back end than you'd pay in the front end for. And a lot of grants have terms and conditions in them that say that you can't use the funds of the grant to fund the grant writing process. So it's going to depend a lot on specifics. No, I don't think you were given misinformation. I just think that it's a complicated area and investors often don't work in grants, which and I don't. Cameron would know a lot more about the grant writing process. Laura would know a lot more about the grant writing process than I would.
It depends on the grant. So grant have very specific items like Cameron mentioned. So there could be a grant that would allow that.
Luckily, I met with the West Plaster Waste Management. They got labs and they're interested in funding my research for the building material.
One grant writer that would work for free is ChatGPT.
That is true.
This is true. I have used ChatGPT for multiple grants. So, yeah, I mean, I've certainly used ChatGPT for some foundation grants and different grants. And I think one of the ways that you can use that tool is, you know, hey, I have this program, or there's a program that you want to mirror, and say, hey, here's something that I'm looking to, here's, you know, you can literally put in the questions, right? It's like, here's the questions of the grant. Here's the program that I want to mirror, and I want to leverage these different assets to be able to write our own proposal. Obviously, you're gonna have to play with the wording, but it will help you spit out an initial proposal for sure. So I think it's a really great way to get started. Maybe we'll reduce some of the costs to getting started to bring in a grant writer. But for the most part, I don't think that that's as viable as an option to get people to grant write and get paid on the back end, especially if standard practice is to be paid upfront. Because why would they take that from you? But I mean, you can certainly go ask people for that. So.
Yeah, I would also say, just like this wasn't the question, but I'm gonna take it whatever direction I want to.
You do you.
You can cut off my mic anytime you want, Cameron. I mean, I would say like this again, I have some strong biases from my work in the space. So I work with mostly venture backable startups, so not necessarily venture backed, but venture backable, which means that they're scalable companies. They're not usually Main Street businesses. They have when we say scale, really large market, but also within that market, their 100th sale is cheaper than their first, and their 1,000th sale is cheaper than their 100th sale, right? So you get those economies of scale, which just creates truly valuable companies. That's where you get those massive exits, right? So those are the venture backable companies. So front loading all of my biases on that. I think for the most part, subject to a few exceptions, that the path to opt into grants is opting into a losing game. It's not sustainable, so it only kicks things off. It can often end up in a lot of dead ends. It's a risky path, and there are oftentimes a lot of better ways to approach early funding. My favorite way of approaching early funding is to not need it. And I think that and this is a cultural bias that we have that I actually think is a pretty big shame, which is I sort of get why, and that's a subject for another time because it's really anything to do with traction. We have this, like, the gravity of fundraising has kind of pushed the culture of entrepreneurship toward, like, that's the path. What it means to be a venture backable startup is that you're going to focus on your pitch and get money, when it's far better to figure out how to get money from customers than to how to get money from investors. And that's the game we call traction, right? So yeah.
No, I think there are certain industries where grants are more primary starter, right? So if you're something in like food and ag or health and life sciences, where there's a lot more grant funding, and you're not likely to even get a product into market until 7 years from now because you have to go through an FDA process or something, that makes a little bit more sense. But if you're like creating a SaaS-based business, that probably isn't a really great point. It's more impactful if you can demonstrate demand by getting people to sign up or prepay or something of that sort. But I definitely agree, as we have skewed more towards getting people investable. And you see that in we even run programs to help people build their pitches, but it's really about actually trying to get the evidence to build the foundation of the business. But yeah, we got a question here.
Yeah, I just want to thank you. So I have a question. From your presentation, it sounds like traction most times is suitable for subscription-based models where people pay and they can have any traction based off of how much how much you collected in terms of sales. But there's another business model, more like the advertising model, where monthly visits are actually very much important to sustain the business before we talk about different monetization models. So the question to you is, how does traction look like for advertising-based business model, just like mine? Is there some yardsticks, more like number of visitors that your business should have, and is that easily backed by venture capital?
I was just going to repeat the question so we can have it on here. So yeah, so in terms of the question, if I'm hearing it right, was the examples we maybe used thus far was related to kind of SaaS-based businesses, and then looking at it, is traction defined in a similar way, or how could we share that from a more advertising, or how I would look at it, platform style business, where you have users and customers, and looking at one, you need evidence for both, right? So you don't have the views unless you have the users or whoever's coming to look at the thing. And then are you getting the right people that the customers want to have in that space, right? And so one of the tools we often teach, it's called the Lean Canvas, but I only bring that up because we've done some workshops with Ash Moria, who created that. And he talked about, and for me, really the conceptualization of when you're creating a platform business, what you're trying to do is create what's called a derivative asset. So your users are coming on and likely leaving data, right? Like that's what becomes valuable. The more users you have, the more information you have about them across other things. It's getting harder and harder based on privacy rules and things like that. But that data is then what you're selling to the advertising companies because you have the real estate that you're actually targeting the right people, right? And so I think when you look at traction is one, are you getting the people you say you're going to be getting to the website that your customers want? And then are the customers getting the return, whether that's click-throughs or whatever the metric they are to ultimately be able to do that? So would love your additional thoughts if I'm on the right path there. Master.
Yeah. So Cameron does have traction answers. See, no, I agree with all that. I might use different words.
Please.
Yeah. So in different words. So I would say to your point, it is the same game. It's actually not any different. There's some timing and order of operations things, but what you're actually doing, like you're trying to create a valuable business, right? And in order to create a valuable business, at that point, you have to have you called it real estate, right? But you have to have the slots or what advertisers would call inventory, right? That you can actually show. The inventory is a function of how many times they can put an ad in front of anybody. Right? So that's a slot. Like you can't, let's just take social media as an example, the feed can't be entirely filled with ads or nobody's going to do it. So they're going to have some, like they've been on the platform X number of times, it's been X number of posts, since they've had, they've spent Y amount of time on the previous post, right? So there's some algorithm that's going to determine their available inventory that they can show to somebody. And so the value of the platform, as far as like advertisers and therefore from a business model perspective, is concerned, that is directly related to the amount of inventory you have. So then what you're trying to do, if we do that leading indicator, do those chains all the way back to the beginning, the way that we get to a bunch of valuable inventory at the end is two things. So first is we have to do all of the things necessary to get inventory up. So that's the number of users, that's their engagement on the platform. It's like, so you're going to have things like, number of registrations, you're going to have daily active users, you're going to have their actual amount of time spent on the platform, which for like TikTok, for example, is ridiculously high. It's like 2 hours a day. Which I totally understand because it's very addictive. But anyway, so those are some of the early metrics you're gonna look at because again, all three of those, just from a math perspective, create the inventory. So that's the first one. The second thing is that Cameron talked about the derivative asset, right? Which is the data. And so like a common misconception, and I'm not saying you were saying this, but just to make sure that we leave everybody on the same page, selling data is a thing. But that's not the advertising model. What they're doing is monetizing the data, and those are two very different things. The data is not shared with advertisers. What they're doing is allowing advertisers to use that data at an aggregate level to put ads in front of the right people, which creates more value. So if you just have a platform that just has a ton of people on it and no data about it, so you've covered the first one, you've got inventory, but you don't have specificity in the assets, you don't have a very valuable advertising platform. Because whatever ads they put are in front of everybody. That's why Facebook or Meta as a broader company or TikTok or anybody else gets that scary level of data about people. And it's because that data creates much more valuable space for advertisers, which is not inherently a bad thing. It also means that the ads that you get are far more likely to be relevant to you. So that like, I'm not saying it's all sunshine and roses, because it's not. And data privacy and trust and safety are big things, and we could have a whole conversation about that. That'd be super fun, off topic, but super fun. But at the same time, like that's how that works. So early on, you're going to have to say, all right, how are we getting up that inventory, which means users, the number of total aggregate users and signups and growth in that, daily active users, the amount of time spent on the platform, probably a couple of other engagement metrics related to that, and retention. So that's all just creating inventory. And then second is, are we gathering data that's going to allow us to create a more valuable ad for those people? So those are going to be the earlier things that you measure. And what you're building is eventually a valuable product, right? But one of the things that I would kind of flip is when you're doing scalable businesses, If your goal is a big exit, the product is the business, right? And so you're trying to build a really valuable business. And when you're doing SaaS, those two things are oftentimes pretty easy to like make as one and the same. But when you're doing advertising, it's not, because you're not collecting any cash. You're going to run in the red for years. Like it's just years. It's just how it works. Because you can't, the ads are worthless until you get all the data and you get all the users. So, the value in the business is in the users. And so that's the value you're building up, is can I get all these users, get them all on the platform, all engaging, and creating all this amazing inventory that I can eventually figure out how to monetize.
Yeah, well said. I think the only element that I would add and thinking about is like you still have to generate value to the user side, right? Like that's ultimately what drives it. And oftentimes, right, like if I'm thinking of like my TikTok, right, it would like the more they know what I'm watching, the more they're sending me the right video. So I'm staying on there more, but then now that's more valuable of what the TikTok shop's sending me, right? So it's like all you're building that cycle that then becomes more and more nuanced of the things that are more likely to convert. And so it's not just getting evidence of like, yeah, the inventory and that asset that you're creating that you can monetize, but you have to still deliver the right value to the users of coming and maintaining that platform. And so I think finding that traction as well is usually really key to getting that going.
In your experience of working with different startups and different business ideas, were there any business ideas that shifted their business models from like the starting stage to the recent funding stage? And what was their impact on the profits? Because they have to test that business model as well.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, so the question was, in our experience working with startups, how many of them have changed their business model from start to eventually when they maybe hit later funding rounds, and then kind of what was the impact on that overall. I got that right? Yeah, okay, cool. I think, I mean, I've worked with, just like loosely, I've worked with thousands of startups, but like formally, I've worked with a little more than 100 to either help them launch or scale. And I'd say, like, if we were to like put it in a percentage, like the number of them that actually changed their business model, it'd be right about 100%. They all do. Like anyone who doesn't, they crash and burn. No, like a 100% they do. And that's because the business model is slightly broader also than most people think. Like there's, I like to think in business model patterns, and there's a great book, I'm blanking on the name, it'll come to me in a minute, but if you Google business model patterns, I think it'll be like the first or second result. Yeah, it's pretty cool. And the book is like half of it's not going to be super useful to startup founders because it's more about a business model innovation at existing companies. But the second half of the book is an appendix, essentially, of these 55 business model patterns. And it's all of the patterns. There are no more. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to today, 90% of all businesses have just been recombining one of these patterns into new usage. And so as an example, way back in the day, in the 1880s, there was a Standard & Poor's had the lamps that they sold. And so they would, the oil lamps, right? And so they sold the oil lamp, and then of course they sold oil as well. And the way oil lamps work is it burns the oil. Therefore, you reuse the lamp, but you have to keep buying more oil. And so that business model of selling the upfront unit and then selling the oil afterward became a pattern. In the early 1900s, 1904, 1906, something like that, this is where, I think his name is King Gillette, I think that was his name, of the Gillette razor company, did basically the same thing. Instead of just having a single unit straight razor thing, it was a unit that you would buy once and then you would swap out the blades because blades get dull. And so it'd be that same exact business model pattern, right? And so that became known as the razors and blades model. Fast forward 50 years, that was used again, that same pattern for printers. You buy an inkjet printer, and then you have to keep buying the cartridges of ink over time, razors and blades. When the iPod launched, exact same idea. You buy the iPod up front, but then you buy songs over time through the iTunes store, and phones, and Kindles, and everything else. So it's the exact same business model pattern through all these different innovations. So if you start thinking in patterns, there are only 55 of them, which is fantastic because you could just go through the list to like start exploring what are the right business model patterns, new ideas. But I started this by saying that we often like are really reductive of what we mean by business model, because sometimes we just mean how do we charge money, and the example that I just gave is evidence of that, because it was how you charge money. But it's also who you target. So one pattern is to target the poor. Another one is to be the ultimate luxury, to target those who have a greater affluence. So those are all patterns as well. So when you think about that, you start incorporating these patterns and say, this is my thing, like there's a lot that's going in there. And as you change audiences and everything else for time, it's just necessarily going to shift as you get data back from the market. So it's just universally true that the business model changes over time. So how does that affect the company? Well, it's like the business model is the center piece of it. The reason, like to go back to like the advertising example, right? Like you were mentioning the value of the platform, right? Because we have to get the value in to get the users, to get the inventory, to get the advertisers. It's all centered around the fundamental business model. So if we were to shift away from an advertising business model into like a monthly subscription thing, like Elon Musk was, I guess, toying around with a little bit for X, then I feel like that's the only way. I know, like I've never the platform formerly known as Twitter. I feel like I don't know Elon Musk, but if he were here, he would want us pronouncing it X. So that's just how I'm going to choose to. It's the only way I'm going to say it out loud. Otherwise, I'm going to call it Twitter. But anyway, so like if you were to change the model to like a subscription from an advertising model, it changes many aspects of the business, because you don't necessarily, it's not about inventory anymore. Now it becomes a completely different game that has to do with primarily delivering value in a sufficient capacity that people are going to pay a monthly fee for it. And there's probably like, well, there's so much of this other stuff, other platforms out there that aren't charging you direct funds for it. So therefore, what is the unique value that we're creating on this platform that's going to get that, right? So it starts just tweaking everything over time. But the easiest way to think about it is, and this will be the last thing I'll say, and I know we have more questions, and I'm sure you've got more, but there's a thing that we call the magic triangle, and it's basically the 3 points of the triangle, and then the center of the triangle is the customer. So you have paper, feel free to try to draw that. But basically, the center of the triangle is the customer, which we call the who question. And at the top of the triangle, we have the what, which is what is the value that we're creating. So what's the value proposition? At the bottom right of the triangle, you have the how question, which is how is value created, how is value delivered to that customer. So you have a value proposition, how are you literally creating that value, delivering it to them. Oh, we're creating a SaaS platform, we're doing this. And this is how we're marketing, you're getting in front of our early adopters and blah, blah, blah. And in the bottom left of the pyramid, you have the why question, which is why does this make money? So not breaking any of that down, if you think about all of those things as connected, when you start to pivot on one of those and you make a change to like, let's say the why question, the why does this make money? Let's say, because that's changing from an advertising model to a subscription model, you can see that line is connected to the who, it's connected to the what, it's connected to the how. And so it changes all of those other things too, by virtue of those things being so tightly connected together. So if you go back to the book whose title I'm blanking on right now, but when they're doing business model innovation for companies, it's basically that same kind of exercise simplified, where it's like, okay, well, this doesn't work anymore. Like we did this for companies during the pandemic, in the early stages, when it's like, okay, well, you can't come into our store anymore. So it's like, okay, that's the how question. The how question's got to change. And so then we come up with we go through the patterns and find other ways to approach the how question. That's going to change the who, it's going to change the pricing, it's going to change the value proposition, it changes those things. So that's kind of how that changes over time. But it's a normal part of the process. It's probably way more detailed than academic response that you're really hoping for, but you're welcome and I'm sorry.
I think the only to deduct some of that, and we're going to go here, and then we'll go to you, Alfredo, was we often talk about business models, how you create, capture, and deliver value. So thinking of those three components of the triangle, and so I think the biggest shifts that we've seen with anyone who goes through one of our programs is they have an assumption of this is who their customer is, and we push them to be even more specific in who that is, and so that's naturally going to change. The who, and once you change the who, then you're changing the value, right? And so all of that changes. I think the patterns, they might shift in terms of like how the monetization actually comes in, but it's really when I think we do take that more bird's eye view of the model of its entirety, and having you think through those different elements of it. Your question.
That book is written by Paul Haig or Alexander Osterwalder?
It's not Alexander Osterwalder. He wrote Business Model Generation, which is where the business model canvas come from. What's the title of the book by Paul Haig?
Business Model Handbook, and business model handbook, and then I think there's business model innovation and the dynamic.
No, it's not it.
Sustainable business model design?
No, I'll find it in just one
we'll
second.
get-
Yeah, during the next question. Oh, I don't have my phone, but I'll find it offline and I'll share it and put it in the notes.
Just get our information and we'll send it your way.
I think you were talking about
Is it okay if I set this here? I'm recording. I gotta use the bathroom.
way to monetize. You had one and you're trying to connect, and that's totally different. He's like multi-layering by adding subscription and maintaining the advertising base.
So the question was, thank you. So the question was that isn't Elon Musk actually trying to add a revenue stream through the subscription model as opposed to replacing advertising? If I'm being honest, I don't think Elon Musk has as sophisticated a pattern as you're making it out to be. He seems to be doing things a little bit more haphazardly. But that having been said, what it kind of comes down to is like there's different approaches to it, and so he's toyed with different ones. And like part of it is like, and we're going to quickly get to something that's beyond my expertise, so I'm going to be a little bit more cautious here. But that the advertisers kind of went in revolt based on a lot of the changes that happened on Twitter, and their advertising revenues went way down. So they were looking for maybe supplementary revenue streams, but then there was also like if I'm remembering correctly, and I'm might be getting this wrong. If somebody here knows, correct me. But they were going to, they were looking at capping the number of posts you could see in a day without actually paying for it. Yeah. Okay. So like that. So there's all those kinds of things that actually change that. The book that I was looking for is called Business Model Navigator. That's the name of the book. So Business Model Navigator, and I'll get the author in just a second. But yeah, Business Model Navigator.
The book? Very good. We've answered it twice.
It's Business Model Navigator.
Good, Laura.
Well, on the topic of books, are there, what are one or two that you might recommend that would help early stage entrepreneurs measure and gain traction at the different stages?
A couple that come to mind for me, and then would love JDM to add. And I think part of it is the mindset that goes into reading the books is not just to read books and then like think that now you're going to start a business, but really that you're applying tools, and the tools need to be put together in a way. So thinking of it like you're going to, I want to go build a fireplace or something of that sort, right? Like, well, you're going to need all different types of tools to actually build that. And you need to know when you need to pull and use certain things in order to do that. And so I think some of the foundational ones that come to mind are Running Lean by Ash Maurya, and I think they have like a third iteration. And one of the things that for me is really valuable on that is when it talks about the lean canvas, which is like taking what's in your head and putting it on paper for the first time, and understanding where that idea lands in terms of different elements, but also he has within that how to kind of set up some of your initial interviewing. So how do you actually go talk to customers and start to de-risk some of the assumptions you have around that? And then that leads me to the Testing Business Ideas book by David Bland. That's kind of having those two combined will help you kind of systematically start to test your assumptions around your business. But I think that those would be like, I think if I'm to just right here and now, that'd be my starter pack for you to look at. One, because I think it'll give you the foundation of like, oh, this is what my idea looks like in all the elements. And then now looking through a Testing Business Ideas lens, what are the riskiest assumptions I need to go test? And it's likely going to be like, oh, who am I targeting? Okay, now I go back to the Running Lean and how do I structure that interview? And I know Josh has talked about a book called The Mom's Test, whereas like, how do you actually structure those conversations in a way that you aren't leading your customer to the answer that you want, because your evidence and the efficacy behind that is not super strong. So that would be my starter pack. I don't know. What about you?
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot about books to recommend. Transparently, I think most books on traction royally suck. But they suck for the reason that Cameron mentioned at the top of his answer, which is that like we can't give a process for everybody to follow because all the startups are different. And so books fall basically into one of two categories. Either they're like reference volumes, which is like some of the things that Cameron was talking about, like here's this collection of tools, and then if you grok those tools and understand when to use them, then in the real world you can pull this tool off the shelf because now is the right moment. You can kind of assemble it yourself. And it's kind of a shitty answer because then I'm basically telling you not to read a book, but read this library of books, which I also think is a waste of entrepreneurs' time. Because just go find a fucking customer. That's at the end of the day, that's my best advice. The second category of books are the ones that try to put some process in place and like here's the steps to do this, and they just suck because there is no universal process for it. And so I don't like that. So some of the books that I would recommend that are in traction, and they'll all be subject to some caveats, is one. I'll give you 3, and one will be kind of like the plot twist one. So the first one, there is a book called Traction. Please ignore the process. It sucks. It's wrong on a number of levels. Like some of the advice in there is like you should spend 50% of your time on traction and 50% on product. I'm like, why are you spending any time on product if it's not getting you traction? That just doesn't. You spend 100% of your time on traction, and if that happens to involve product work, that's great. But anyway, so ignore the process, but there actually are a ton of tools in there that you can use, like a bunch of strategies that you can actually employ to find some early customers, do some growth hacking and stuff like that. So good collection in there. Second book would be from Alexander Osterwalder and David Bland called Testing Business Ideas, which is part of the Strategizer series. So that one in there, the process at the top it's illustrative, it's informative. I just don't think it's not something that like a startup is meant to follow from like step 1, step 2, step 3. It's not like that because it's also applicable to corporate innovation and everything else. So it's just like read through the process and grok why he's talking about those things, but then just kind of set it aside. But the really valuable part of that is that David collected together 45 different ways that you can test a business idea. That's the title of the book, broken down into 2 categories: customer discovery and customer validation, which are roughly like the first 2 stages of the customer development process. So first figuring out like qualitatively, do customers have this problem? Is there a need there? Is there a there kind of thing? And the second one's actually like testing behavior. And so there's literally 45 different tools that you can use to try to do our categories of tools rather than you should use that. So again, fantastic compendium that I would do that. So Testing Business Ideas by David Bland. And then the third one, this is the wild card that's not going to seem a lot like it has to do with traction, but it's called Where to Play. Which I know you had Sharon Tall, right? Yeah. So maybe that recording is something we can look there too. But so it's by Mark Gruber and Sharon Tall, and the basic premise of the book is about understanding with what market opportunities you should actually be making your play. That's where do we want to make our play? And so it breaks down this idea of a market opportunity as an internal capability plus your like some core competency that you have, plus a customer segment that could use that in some combined way, then a system for a process you can use to actually evaluate which of those opportunities are more likely to be successful in the short term, and then having some like pivot or backup plans as well as growth opportunities that you can use for that, which is really cool. So it's a not even very long book. It's actually pretty short, but it's great. And there's little worksheets and stuff that you can use for that. So just having kind of that in the back of your mind would be great. And I did that. So that's my 3, but I did already mention Business Model Navigator, which just again, those patterns are really helpful. If all you want is the patterns and none of the stuff surrounding it, the book was based on a paper that the authors did at St. Gallen's, and I have that paper. You can get it off the internet. You can actually just download and read that. It's a journal article, so it's got some density to it, but there is a table with all of those 55 patterns as part of it. So I would probably jump to that over the book until such a time as you need to dive into more detail.
Yeah, and Josh mentioned that we had Sharon Tall, who authored Where to Play, and then we also had David Bland, who was one of the co-authors of Testing Business Ideas, run a workshop, and then Ash Moria as well. So that's part of our on-demand innovation series. So if you go to the Carlson Center website under our build category, you can just put in your name, email, and some things about your idea or where you're at in your startup process, and we'll send you all of that content. So that's accessible to you. And I think, the books are valuable in terms of applying them as tools, and often, we in supporting founders are like, hey, this is where you'd use this tool in terms of like the discovery process or what you need to test, but it's not just something like you do once, right? It's like you got to hone that process. And I think just in terms of the authors, that's just one way of disseminating that information. And a lot of it's how do you, the nuances of using the tools. It's not a checkbox, it's a for you to gain more and more evidence. So
if I could like just kind of double down on that, I have this metric that I used that I consider to be how like the best way to evaluate an entrepreneur, not their startup, but the best place to evaluate an entrepreneur, and it's a metric that I call time to customer, or TTC. And so the time to customer is the amount of time it takes to go from idea to when something is shown to a real customer. And that doesn't mean that it's buyable at that point, but it's anytime you're getting an idea out of your head and exposing it to a customer. And that in a really early stages is like, I have this cockamamie scheme for this like crazy product idea. And so it's like putting something like that in front of it. But when you're much further along, it could be a feature. It could be like, we think we can increase the retention on our platform by adding this new feature in there. It's the amount of time that it takes to take that idea out of your head and get it in front of a customer using any one of the techniques in like David's book or any of the other books that we've mentioned as well. So like just just set tools aside, set like all the methodology process, set everything aside, figure out what is the quickest possible, most efficient way to actually close that time to customer, get that as close to zero as possible without ruining the whole thing. And just if you make that your goal, then what's going to happen is you'll end up being able to ask a lot smarter questions. And then it'll be something where Cameron or me or Laura or anybody else can go, oh, by the way, that's a great question. Either like I've seen this work before, or go check out actually in David's book in the second section, he talks about this particular tool, like check that out. And it's just a much better way to do it. And it's not because we have the answers. We actually don't have answers. It's because you're coming to us with a much better question. And it's because you know, like, this is what I want to do. So figure out, how do I close the time to customer? How do I get the closest zero as possible? That's what's going to make you a successful entrepreneur.
Kind of as a follow-on to that, I'm building something for a community I'm a part of. Just curious, just getting started, what would be the first steps after I've talked to a bunch of people in the community? What are the next steps I would do to try and start building and testing?
So the question was like, what he's engaging a community and his first steps in kind of like taking next steps, or where would you start? I guess, or you've already been talking to people. So I guess I would ask a question: what are you talking to them about?
So mainly the pain points, and there's one that just keeps coming up. So and that I'm trying to build something.
So yeah, it sounds like you're working on the right things of identifying what the pain point is, and I think part of that is I don't have enough information on what the community or the pain point is, but I think diving into the nuances, and is there specific people within the community that have that pain point, or where in the list of their priorities in life that pain point falls, right? Is that like, yeah, I engage this community once a quarter and I have this frustration, but I also have other things and bills to pay that are more important than that. And so that, I think, like ranking where that falls in that core persona, and I think that is narrowing down on who within that community and where within that priority list is that problem space would be where I would focus my energy on. I don't know what comes to mind for you. And
yeah, no, I perfectly said. So I will let that stand and then just say what might come after that. I think at some point through this process, and you may be here already, but at some point through this process, you're going to have an idea for how to solve that problem, right? And so at that point, then I would say, okay, how can I get that idea in front of those people who have that pain to see if they go, yes, right? Like, take my money, or however it works, and whatever that right metric is at the time. And so for that, once you get to that point, that's where you can like pick up David Bland's book and just like scroll to the customer validation section. I was saying scroll in a physical book, but just flip through the pages, right, to get to the customer validation section, and you can like look at the different ways that you can test that. You can do landing page tests, you can do rapid prototyping, you can do some facade work with Zapier and stuff like that, like Wizard of Oz type stuff, or any number of other things. So once you think you have an idea, again, close the time to customer, say what's the fastest way I can put that idea in front of those people who, like Cameron was saying, have that problem, like experience it urgently, so that they know that they want the problem solved, and that this is the way that they want to solve it.
Yeah, and one additional maybe follow-up question is, how are they trying to solve the problem now? I don't, are they currently trying to solve it, or are you the one person in the community like leading that charge?
Usually they're posting in the community to try and get that problem solved.
Got it. So that seems like a good forum for that conversation. So yeah, so I think when we are helping someone kind of go through that, was one is like, okay, you've identified the problem. How are they trying to solve the problem? If they're not really trying to solve the problem, it's not usually that important to them. One, they might be sharing it, but it's not on their top of their priority if they're not already like trying to actively like do something to create it. And so that will help you nuance that on down. I think one of the tools you might be able to look at and we can share is the early adopter pyramid. So it helps you kind of like narrow that down into who those specific people in your community might be. And again, that's a tool, a frame of reference for you to start to do that, but it takes the hard work of like actually talking to them and seeing if they're like having that pain point and that they're actively creating a solution and like put resources towards it. So.
How would you go about this experimenting when the people who have the problem and you validated they have the problem, they're looking for a solution, but they're not the person who would actually buy the product? So it could be a parent would buy it, or in a big institution, it would be that, some overhead organization. Is there something you need to do different in your investigation to solve for that?
Go for it.
So so the question is if you're the primary user of it is not the same as the economic buyer, then how does that change like the investigation process? So like if it's an app for kids but parents are paying, or if it's B2B and like the people who are using it is not it's 3 levels up where the CFO buys it or something like that, like how does that change this whole investigation process if you want to like run one of these experiments? It definitely changes it, but there's going to be a lot that depends on circumstance. That depends on like the individual specifics in terms of like order of operations. But just to give like some examples, one of the ways that I like to think about it is I do what I call value mapping. This is where I literally like take a dry erase board or FigJam or Miro or Mural or whatever you like, if you like the digital thing, and just list all of the players in the ecosystem. And so there'd be the students and the parents and probably somebody else in there as well. Maybe teachers are part of this mix, the babysitter, like who knows. And then in a business environment, you have you have you and you have the user, you have the user's boss, maybe you have the economic buyer. There's also other people in there. There's saboteurs. Right? There's people in the company who probably don't want this deal to go through for whatever internal political reasons happen. There's always saboteurs and that kind of deal. So you kind of get those all on the board. Then you start drawing arrows between them to map the flow of value. Like how is value moving through the ecosystem? Who's getting value? What does that value look like? And then as you start getting that map out, that starts to tell you what the value propositions are to the different groups and where it's strong and where it's weak. It also can tell you where the money usually needs to come from, right? So a lot of people will just draw this map and they'll realize that they're trying to collect money from somebody who's not getting any value, and that never works, right? So then it can kind of clarify those. But once you have that kind of understanding, then you can say like, am I talking to 2 different people about the same thing with a different message? So it's like, the main employee at the business, they need this thing and they need to use it, but their boss needs to see, X, Y, and Z, get this value out of it. Then, in some cases, all things being equal, it makes more sense to go to the boss, right? Because they can just mandate that their employees use it. And then the secondary question would be that employees actually continue to use it, right? But the primary question was can we get the boss to mandate it? If that's not the case, and it's more about the employees advocating for something, and somebody else just literally pulls the purse strings or holds the purse strings, then it becomes different. Then you want to come at it the other way, because you need to actually determine that they're going to be those internal advocates for the thing. But it creates this more complicated network. And by far, I think the best way to think about which angle do you go about it first? Because I wouldn't do it all at once, right? Because it's just taking on too much risk. Is to say, what's the riskier assumption? So if you're doing like a parent-kid model, then it's going to depend on is the riskiest assumption that kids will use it. So like if you're trying to develop gamified learning, then it's probably that, right? Because if it you put it in front of kids all day long, they don't use it, right? And who cares at the end of the day? But if it's something else that's more fun for kids, like a literal game that has no educational value, but parents are still paying for it, then it might change that a little bit. Like, what is it going to take to get parents to buy that kind of thing? And then that might be the riskier assumption. Then I would test that one first, because it's not that they're not important. It's just like one of them is more important right now because it's the monkey on the pedestal. Do you guys know that metaphor? Okay, I'm blinking on the book where this comes from. I don't think it had anything to do with entrepreneurship at all. But the basic metaphor is, let's say your boss tells you that your work product, what you need to do is teach a monkey to recite Shakespeare on a pedestal. And so most people, the first thing they'll do is build a pedestal. Because it's easy, there's measurable progress, right? Your boss, every time they come in, see the pedestal's a foot higher, does whatever. And so but that's not the hard part, was not the pedestal. The hard part was getting the monkey to recite Shakespeare. And so it's that, so a good thing whenever you're working with me is to always ask yourself, what's my monkey? Because it's like, that's the thing that you need to focus on first. And our brains are just built, we're hardwired. And I'm like this, any other skill I have, this is by far the thing I am best at. Like universally, is coming up with all the things I could do that aren't the thing I need to do, and then focusing all my time on that and come up with amazing justifications. This is where you get fancy websites and logos and better processes and a tool for this, and it's all amazing, but it's not worth shit because it wasn't the monkey on the pedestal. I'm just building the pedestal all the time. So it's that kind of thing. It's in the case of your question, Laura, it's probably not as obvious as the pedestal and the monkey, but it's the same idea. It's like, what's the monkey on the pedestal? And like, do that because it's the only thing that matters.
Yeah, I'm only going to add on to this last part. We've had a lot of conversations around kind of what we call make work, is where we're doing the things that aren't making tangible progress towards us actually gaining evidence around that customer buying behavior, because that work feels productive and it's like something usually tangible, but it doesn't actually take us in a step in the right direction. And so the language around going and actually talking to customers is more of that adaptive work, right? We don't actually know what the answer is, and we have to go explore the unknowns to figure out what those answers are. And I think it's even more complicated in a B2B or an ecosystem environment. And I think you nailed it, is like focus on where the most risky component is, like who's getting the most value out of it in terms of like going to be likely using it potentially. So we have time for maybe one last question, and then we'll wrap for our Traction AMA.
While you guys are thinking, we got it. Okay, cool.
We'll go right here. You had one right here.
Yeah. So my question again is trying to get across to customers, because specifically to us, we currently have like actually about 300 active users on our website. Now, what we want to do is we want to scale. Now, what's the scale? Just stick to the market. We're trying to increase that number. Let's just start with 2,000, from 300 to 2,000. So the problem now is, how do you get users to use your product that's a digital product? Because that was the first problem that we had initially. I went to the site to talk to renters who are the pain point of price, and they want to find faster reviews online. But the question is, when we build the website, we didn't really translate. So an hypothesis could be people who I was talking to say they're going to use the website. Probably at their free time, they don't use the website. So the best thing we should have done was to put an online community of renters, because we know these guys actually go online to rent. Then we'll talk about the pain points. Then we can now bring them out and have a one-on-one, because now we're getting specific. So that's the question. How do you, now that we've gotten these users and these renters who have a specific problem, where do we get more of this kind of our target market to ensure that our product goes, our users Cool. Because it's an advertised model. There's a chicken and egg problem because you have to first build one component for the build the other, or how do you go around working around some problems?
That was quite a big question. And like 14 sub questions in there. Cameron's like, one last question. It's like, well, let me ask my 9-part question here. That's some serious JDM vibes with that question. Okay, it's what I usually do at 1 Million Cups. Yeah, I know, it's my turn. Okay, so the core of it was 300 active users. How do you get to 3,000 of them? And I'm not going to repeat the rest. Hopefully the audio picks up and we can just use it. But a few things came to mind, right? So there's a couple of different ways I want to approach that. So first one is the way to think about growth in an early stage startup, we think about traction, is to think in 10x. So it's where does your first customer come from, then 10, then 100, then 1,000, then 10,000. And there's all kinds of different techniques and things you can use that for, but to me, it's a mental framework. It's because most people try to jump to how do I get 10,000 users? And it's like that's not a thing. There's no such thing as getting 10,000 users. You first have to get one. So where's the one coming from? And then where are the next 10? Because at each of those stages, the customer acquisition strategies are very, very different. The one customer is probably manual. The 10 customers are probably manual. 100 customers, probably not, but it's probably largely manual or heavily manual, or you got a big heavy hand of the founder in it. But then when you get to 1,000, that doesn't really work anymore. And so you have to use different strategies, but now you have all this customer evidence. You've learned a lot from the market. You know how to get in front of people where they are. And so the game changes as you go. And those numbers aren't 1, 10, 100, and 10,000. That's just, a number that we can use that's easy to kind of delineate stages. Think about that way and understand like strategies are different. And what does it look like to as we scale? Even in terms of like small scale, but even as we start to like scale that, how is our strategy going to have to shift? And what did we learn from the previous stage that we can leverage in the future stage? So we learned, like we got them all manually by talking to them, and in those process we learned that like this is their major, these are their major influences, and one of those is an influencer on TikTok, and that influencer is somebody that we can leverage for money, like that kind of thing, right? So there's that. Next thing I'll say is you mentioned about like getting them to use the website. So like that goes back to that business model triangle thing, that what versus how is the important question, because what is the value proposition? So like even if they have the problem that you think they do and it's severe and urgent and they want a solution and they want your solution, so like they opt into the value proposition, it doesn't mean that they want the value created that way, right? And so like that, and that's why how and what are different questions. Because it could be, you could take the same value proposition and solve it, even at like the high level. You could solve it with an app, you could solve it with a service, you could solve it with hardware of some kind, with a robot or whatever. There's a number of different ways to solve it. And then when you get even more detailed than that, like even if you like take the software category, it could be a mobile app, it could be a web app, it could be a desktop app, it could be, right? There's all these different ways to do it. Even within that, like you can break the how down even further, and we start talking features. So like those two things are very different, right? And so you have it's separate questions. Now that we have customers that are saying that they want this value that we're saying that we can create, then it's about what is the right way to create that value for them. And that kind of like translates through the rest. As you talk about engagement and getting people to keep using the platform, it comes up the same way, because like there's a finite number of engagement strategies that you can use, right? So you can do notifications where like it's either a push notification, email notification, text notification, doesn't matter. Say like, come back to the app, right? So you can do that, or you can gamify it to try to get people wanting to like accrue a score by continuing to engage with the app. And all of those things you do, like there's a bunch of those little strategies. They're defined, they're well known, like we all use them and see them every single day. But they only work if those points of request for engagement are done in exchange for value, right? And so it's like the value of a to-do app reminding you about an overdue task is that we feel better having not dropped the ball. We feel better about getting the task done. Or we might feel better about saying, oh, actually, you know what, that wasn't really important. I'm going to nix that from my list, which also frankly feels pretty good. So we're getting value out of it by getting those reminders. And so, or at least some subset of users are. And so you have to figure out like, how can we create value over time such that people want to come back? Then the rest of it is we can optimize that coming back through all of these engagement strategies. And then you get people coming back, through that way. So I would think about it like from those like few perspectives. It's like we have the value. this is the value that they want. Are we creating it the right way? And then over time, or can we continue to create value? And then how do we optimize that experience to like just increase those numbers? And then the third thing is like that I would just think about scale like differently and say, what does the next stage look like is different to the previous stage?
And I think super simple to me would be just if you have the capacity to go back to those users and see how did they come, why did they come, and do they know other people that would need that value, right? And so leveraging that community that you already have on there to help inform how you get to the next 3,000, because that's usually they have the same characteristics in places that they've looked, and especially if it was more manual of like, hey, I'm bringing you on, like where would you have gone to like search for these things, right? And you can better understand and gain some of that insight and information. But I would go back to your existing users, and especially the ones that are very active on the platform of what they're actually getting out of it. Awesome. Well, with that, thank you all for digging into the questions and stumping JDM and me, and was a lot of fun digging in. So thank you all for being here. Cheers.
Thanks, Cameron. It was a lot of
Thanks
fun.
for coming on. And I don't know if it considers one of our Zero to Traction podcasts.
Yeah, we might throw this up as an episode of our Zero to Traction podcast, which I said at the top I'd plug and never did. So for those of you who are curious, it's a podcast about how first-time founders create companies that scale. It's called Zero to Traction. Cameron and I are the regular co-hosts, but most episodes we bring on other guest co-hosts, and it's not an interview podcast. There are other fantastic podcasts for that, including some that are coming out in the near future. This is just about how can we have a conversation like with successful, cool people that we like hanging out with, frankly, around a topic that we find interesting and share stories and knowledge and experience and all. So yeah, give it a listen. Cheers. Cool. Thanks.